asceticism, punctuated at intervals by appropriate tests and ordeals to determine their fitness to proceed to the more serious, solemn and awful processes of actual initiation, administered only to the duly qualified, and which were of a secret and closely guarded character. Their education, differing greatly from the scholastic methods of a utilitarian age like our own, was directed solely to the cultivation of the 4 cardinal virtues and the 7 liberal arts and sciences as qualifications prerequisite to participation in the higher order of life to which initiation would eventually admit the worthy and properly prepared candidate. The construction put upon these virtues and sciences was a much more advanced one than the modern mind considers adequate. Virtues with them are more than abstractions and ethical sentiments. As the word itself implies, they involved positive valors and virility of soul. Temperance involved complete control of the passional nature under every circumstance, fortitude, the courage that no adversity will dismay or deflect from the goal in view, prudence, the deep insight that begets the prophetic or forward-seeing faculty of seership, providentia, justice, unswerving righteousness of thought and action. The arts and sciences were called liberal because they tended to liberate the soul from defects and illusions normally enslaving it, thus totally differing from science in the modern sense, the tendency of which is, as we know, materialistic and soul-benumbing. Grammar, logic and rhetoric with the ancients were disciplines of the moral nature, by which the irrational tendencies of a human being were purged away and he was trained to become a living witness of the universal logos and a living mouthpiece of the divine word. Geometry and arithmetic were sciences of transcendental space and numeration, seeing that, as in the words of our own scriptures, God has made everything by measure, number and weight, the comprehension of which provides the key, not only to the problems of one's being, but to those physical ones which are found so baffling by the inductive methods of today. Astronomy for them required no telescopes, it dealt not with the stars of the sky, but was the science of metaphysics and the understanding of the distribution of the forces latent in, and determining the destiny of, individuals, nations and the race. Finally music, or harmony, was for them not of the vocal or instrumental kind, it meant the living practice of philosophy, the adjustment of human life into harmony with God, until the personal soul became unified with Him and consciously heard, because it now participated. The 4 cardinal virtues are referred to in both Plato's Phaedo and the Book of Wisdom, ch. 8:5-7, indicating community of teaching between the Greek and Hebrew schools. In The Music of the Spheres, as Milton puts it: "How lovely is divine philosophy, not harsh and crabbed as dull fools suppose, but musical as is Apollo's lute and a perpetual feast of nectared sweets where no crude surfeit reigns." Every possible device was employed in practice to train the mind to acquire dominion over the passions and to loosen and detach it from the impressions and attractions of the senses, to destroy the illusions and false imaginations under which it labors when using no higher light than its own, and to qualify it for higher method of cognition and for the reception of supersensual truth and the light of the divine world. The idealism of Greek architecture and sculpture was entirely due to the same motive and with the view to elevating the imagination beyond the visible level and fitting the mind for the apprehension of ultra-physical form and beauty. Even athletic exercises were made to subserve the same purpose. Wrestling and racing were not vulgar sports, they were regarded sacramentally, as the type of combats the soul must engage in against the competition of the fleshly desires, and the victor's crown of laurel olive was the emblem of wisdom and illumination resulting to him in whom the spirit conquers the flesh. Thus every intellectual and physical interest was made subservient to the one idea of separating the soul from material bondage and was purposely of a purifying or cathartic nature that should cleanse the thoughts and desires of the aspirant and make him white within and without, even as the modern candidate for the craft is clothed in white. This inward purity of heart or in mind, coupled with the possession of the 4 cardinal virtues, was and still is an absolute essential to the ordeals of actual initiation, which otherwise rendered the candidate liable to insanity and obsessions of which the modern mind in its ignorance of what initiation involves can form no opinion. Those who became proficient and properly prepared in this curriculum of the lesser mysteries were eventually admitted to initiation in the greater mysteries. Those who failed to qualify were restrained from advancement. As now, the numbers of really earnest and qualified aspirants were only a percentage of the total of those who enter the mysteries. For in the spiritual life, as in the world of nature, the biological phenomenon prevails that the available raw material greatly exceeds the perfected product. Every year far more seeds are born, far more eggs are laid or spawned, than reach maturity, although every seed and egg is potentially capable of growth and fruition. Plato, speaking of the mysteries in his own day, quotes a still older authority that the thyrsus or candidates for initiation, are numerous, but the batches, or perfected initiates, are few. The same truth is restated in the words in the Gospels, many are called, but few are chosen. One qualification above all was essential to the thyrsus, or caduceus, was an elaborate wand borne by the candidate, to the symbolism of which deep meaning attached. Its present form is the one carried by the deacon accompanying the candidate. Aspirant, as it is still today, humility. The wisdom into which the mysteries and initiation admit a man is foolishness to the world. It is a reversal and revolution of all orthodox and academic standards. To attain it, a man must be prepared for that complete and voluntary self-denial which may involve his finding negated everything he has previously held to be true, or which those among whom he ordinarily mingles believe to be true. He must be content to become a fool for the kingdom of heaven's sake and to suffer adversity, ridicule and obloquy for it if needs be. This was one of the prime reasons for secrecy and one, though not the only one, of the origins of the Masonic injunction as to secrecy. The world's wisdom and that to which initiation admits are so antipodal in their nature that any intrusion of the latter will infallibly provoke resentment from the former. Hence it is written, "Cast not your pearls before swine, neither give that which is holy unto dogs, lest they turn and rend you." Silence and secrecy are, therefore, desirable if only in self-defense, though there are other reasons, but humility is indispensable. In the public processions of the lesser mysteries, for the public were permitted at certain festivals to participate to a small extent in some of the more exoteric knowledge. The sacred emblems and Eucharistic vessels used in the rites were carried with great reverence upon the back of an ass. With the same intention, it is said that one of the great Greek philosophers always had an ass by his side in his lecture room when instructing his students. The explanation is given in the words of one of the old authorities upon initiation as follows: "There is no creature so able to receive divinity as an ass, into whom if ye be not turned, ye shall in no wise be able to carry the divine mysteries." In the light of this, one will at once discern the symbolical significance of the Christian master riding into Jerusalem upon an ass. Another and a greatly educative means employed in the mysteries was that of instructing, enlarging and purifying the imagination by means of myths, expressing either in doctrinal form or by spectacular representation, truths of the divine world and of the soul's history. The modern mind in its passion for actual concrete facts is little sympathetic to a method of teaching which dispenses with demonstrable facts and prefers to enunciate the eternal principles underlying such facts and of which those facts are but the manifested result and consequence. Facts of history or science tend, however, to congest the mind and paralyze the imagination, as Darwin lamented in his own case. Principles stimulate and illumine the imagination, and enable the mind to interpret facts and adjust them to their proper relation. The Greek mythologists were adepts at expressing cosmic and philosophic truths in the guise of fables which at once expressed theosophic teaching to the discerning and veiled it from the careless and ignorant. Myth-making was a science, not an indulgence in irresponsible fiction, and by exhibiting some of these myths in dramatic form, candidates were instructed in various fundamental verities of life. One of the chief and best known of the numerous myths was that of Demeter and her daughter Persephone, annually performed with great ceremony and elaboration at the Eleusinian, and of which it may be useful to speak briefly. It told how the maiden Persephone strayed away from Arkla, heaven, and her mother Demeter, to pluck flowers in the meads of Ina, and how the soil there opened and caused her to fall through into the lower dark world of Hades ruled over by Pluto. That despair of her mother at the loss reached Zeus, the chief of the gods, with the result that he relieved the position by ordaining that, if the girl had not eaten of the fruit of Hades, she should forthwith be restored to her mother forever, but that if she had so eaten she must abide a third of each year with Pluto and return to Demeter for the other 2/3. It proved that Persephone had unfortunately eaten a pomegranate in the lower world, so that her restoration to her mother could not be permanent, but only periodic. This myth, and the importance once attached to it, will be appreciated only upon understanding its interpretation. It is the story of the soul and is of the same nature as the Mosaic myth of Adam and Eve and the apple, and as the cosmic parable of the prodigal son, neither of these being meant to be regarded as historically true, but as a fiction spiritually true of cosmic facts. Persephone is the human soul, generated out of that primordial incorruptible Mother Earth which the Greeks personified as Demeter, just as the Mosaic narrative speaks of God forming man out of the dust of the ground. Her straying from her Arcadian home and heavenly mother in quest of flowers, or fresh experiences on her own account, in the fields of Ina, corresponds with the same promptings of desire that led to Adam's disobedience in Eden and his fall thence to this outer world. All unruly desires end in dissatisfaction and bitterness, and Ina, signifying darkness and bitterness, is the same word as still meets us in Gehenna. One may, however, profit by one's mistakes. It is they which breed wisdom, and it is the riches of wisdom and experience that are signified by Pluto, the god of riches, into whose kingdom Persephone falls. She might have returned thence to her mother forever, Zeus decreed, had she not still further injured herself by eating of the fruit of the lower world, but having done so her restoration can only be partial and temporary. This alludes to the soul's still further self-soilure and degradation by lusting after the inferior pleasures of this lower plane, which, as the pomegranate symbolizes, is many-seated with illusions and vanities. Until these false tendencies are eradicated, until the desires of the heart are utterly weaned from external delights, there can be no permanent restoration of the soul to its source, but merely the periodic respite and refreshment that death brings when it withdraws the soul from Pluto's realm to the heaven world, to be followed again and again by periodic descents into material limitations and reascents into discarnate conditions, until it becomes finally purged and perfected. By this great myth, therefore, instruction was imparted as to the history of the soul, its destiny and prospects, and the doctrine of reincarnation was emphasized. How Masonry follows this traditional method of instruction by myths. Its canon of teaching in the craft degrees contains two myths. One is that of the building of King Solomon's temple. The other is that of the death and burial of Hiram Abiff narrated in the traditional history. The Royal Arch contains a third myth in the story of the return from captivity after the destruction of the first temple, the commencement to build the second, and the discovery then made. This third myth has already been expounded in our paper on the Royal Arch degree, so that we need now speak only of the craft myths. To the literal-minded, the building of Solomon's temple at Jerusalem, which is of course largely but not entirely based upon the Hebrew scriptures, appears to be the history of an actual stone and mortar structure erected by three Asiatic notables, one of whom conceived the idea, another supplying the building material, whilst the third was the practical architect and chief of works. The two former are said to have been kings of adjacent small nations, the third was not a royalty, but apparently a person of no social dignity and a widow's son. As has previously been said in these papers, these details of an enterprise undertaken more than two. As this doctrine is not popularly inculcated in the West as it is in the East, and will be novel and probably unacceptable to some readers, its acceptance is not pressed here. We are merely recording what the secret doctrine teaches. 1,000 years ago can have no possible value to anyone today, and if they related merely to historic fact, modern Masonry might as well close its doors and cease to exist for any benefit that fact could impart to serious or reflective minds. But if the narrative were never intended as a record of temporal history,